On Monday, the 3 suspects who were arrested in connection with the murder of 85-year-old Hetta Potgieter appeared at the Nelspruit Magistrate Court. Hetta was recently murdered in her retirement village Macadamia Care Centre. John Deploy, Sean Oosthuizen and Marina Mandy Foster were arrested on Friday in a caravan park near Krugersdorp where they were hiding.
The bail will be opposed by the state, so we will be prepared to oppose the bail on the next appearance.
He is someone we know so little about, but he had a devastating and traumatic impact on the victims and families he left behind. He will slip into your home, take what he wants, making no noise to wake those deep in sleep. He steals all things of value while his accomplice waits outside, ready to make the final blow. He would leave no witnesses, even though they were asleep and never heard them coming. These elderly residents would hang up calls with their loved ones, place their slippers neatly beside their bed, ready for daybreak. But what would creep into their homes would ultimately rob them and their loved one's life, all for a little extra cash. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. And firstly, I would like to say I'm sorry for not uploading consistently recently. I'm just coming out of my really busy season at work, so I'm not having to work weekends anymore. Finally. But today we have a case that really pulls on my heartstrings, and I think that there is a special place in hell for those who attack the elderly or the vulnerable, and this person that we're going to talk about is really a piece of work. But with that being said, let's hop straight into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Sean Oosthuizen was born in 1980, and not a lot was noted about his life and his upbringing. But Sean was a very aloof person, and he continued this way throughout his life and as he grew older. When Sean was 19 years old, he had his first child with his girlfriend, who he was on and off with at the time. And Sean was in and out of prison at least 7 times. He was really the troublemaker in his really early teen years. Most of these crimes included burglary, robbery, and specific to home invasion. But besides his criminal activities, he would legally try and do some work where he would work on cars as a mechanic, and he would try and earn money this way. But obviously when things weren't doing too well or when opportunity arose, he would then commit certain crimes. But because he lived in quite a small area and he kept getting arrested for robbery and home invasions, the people in the area knew him really well, and people started to avoid him and didn't want to be associated with him because they knew what he was doing. So when he was released the 6th or 7th time from prison, he then decided to move. Sean then decided to move to an area called Munsieville, which is in the Gauteng province, and also in the Krugersdorp area. Munsieville was mainly an area that was built informally for mine workers who bordered Krugersdorp itself. There is a much bigger history to Munsieville and the housing plan of 1913. And also an interesting fact about Munsieville is that Archbishop Desmond Tutu grew up in the area. So while this was all happening, Sean's move was happening, there was also another quite significant thing happening outside of Krugersdorp. In 2014, quite a large number of elderly Afrikaners who were kind of bordering the outskirts of Krugersdorp in informal settlement. They were basically living on land that was not theirs, and the owner who owned this land said, okay, when they first moved there, they had caravans, they had specific plots that they were living on. He said, okay, you can do this for a small fee. This fee ended up not being paid over a number of years, and the caravans turned into bigger kind of housing structures. And the owner of the land, when he returned, he just saw how much devastation this had done to his land, and he said, you got to get off. And they were told to get off this land. And so this elderly group of Afrikaners who lived in caravans moved to Munsieville. But when they moved to Munsieville, they were very much on the outskirts of the area. And interestingly enough, there's actually a YouTube video on what the area that these elderly Afrikaners lived in, and I'll link it down below if you want to watch that as well. So while the Afrikaners moved to the edge of Munsieville, there was quite a bit of press coverage about this. They were getting quite a lot of sympathy and a lot of donations for their move to the area. And of course, I do feel bad for elderly people who have nowhere to go, and especially if they're destitute, I think help is needed. But I do think that with Munsieville itself being quite an informal area, there were donations that could have been given to the area as a whole, which could have been helped, especially if government wasn't helping to uplift the area that was now becoming bigger with a lot more inhabitants in the area. But the point of all of this is, remember Sean. Sean was living in Munsieville as well. And he started seeing all these newspapers about all these elderly people getting donations, about all these caravans that were moving here, how they kept their caravans unlocked, and how much press and how many people were bringing things and objects and valuable objects to these elderly Afrikaners. And I'm not talking about just donations like, oh, let's give you a little bit of food. They were TVs, stoves, microwaves, massive appliances, and massively expensive items being given to this group that had just moved there. But what's that saying about double trouble? Because this is very much true with Johnny du Plooy and Sean Oosthuizen. Johnny du Plooy was a friend of Sean, but before we go further into their connection, Sean actually had another child by the time he moved to Munsieville in 2014. So he now had 2 children, but it did seem like he was in a more committed relationship with his second child's mother. They struggled to make ends meet, but they did try and work legally when they first moved to Munsieville. So back to Johnny. He is 12 years younger than Sean Oosthuizen and very much looked up to Sean in terms of how he was a mechanic, how he fixed cars, and he really enjoyed watching Sean, and they were very close. Johnny du Plooy also had a child, so Sean and Johnny had lots of things in common, but one thing they didn't have in common was that Johnny did not have an extensive rap sheet like Sean had. He was not very well known to the law if he did commit any crimes, but he had no criminal record at that point. Like I said, both men would work on vehicles in order to make money, but this was far and few between, and the two were really struggling to make ends meet and to be able to feed their children and support the household. But now there's also a third player in what we're going to get into in the crimes later, and that is Morena Forster. She is 48 years old at the time, but I also don't think I've mentioned Sean's age, and he's 38 and Johnny du Plooy is 26. So when we get into this case, I'm going to say it in chronological order and how they happened, but I do just want to point out that criminals, as we've mentioned so many times on this channel, they don't always get caught in chronological order of their crime. Sometimes they only get caught right at the end of their crime spree. And the reason why I'm also going to put them in order is because we are going to see how these crimes escalated. And I feel like these weren't the only crimes that they committed, but these were the crimes that they were caught for. 93-year-old Emma Horson lived in a retirement home in Sunnyside. On the 5th of December 2015, she had not been heard from for 2 days. Now, I know that some retirement homes are very hands-on. You have nurses coming into your room often, take your blood pressure, check that you're all right, feed you, whatever they need to do, bathe you. But even though Emma was elderly, she was very independent, she was very fit, and she wanted to do things herself. She also lived in something called an independent retirement home, where she did everything herself. So she had her own kitchen, she cooked her own meals, she cleaned herself, she made sure that she was fine, but she lived within like a complex of people who were elderly, who had different needs, and there were nurses and doctors on site if need be, but she lived completely independently. But by day 2, people who knew Emma when she would get out every day, they noticed that they hadn't seen her for 2 days, so people started reporting it to the other nurses and staff who worked at the retirement village. So when the staff first arrived, they knocked on Emma's door. Nothing, silence. They then had a key to her apartment and they opened the door. Nothing. It was very quiet in her apartment. They then walked around. They had a look around. They did notice that things seemed to be out of place, but because Emma lived independently, they couldn't say for sure that that's how she did or didn't keep her apartment, because staff weren't in the home every single day. They saw Emma, they saw that she was fine, but they weren't inside her private residence. So things looked a little bit messy, but that's just maybe how she lived. They weren't sure. So they had a look around. They didn't see her, but as they were about to leave her bedroom, they heard this very, very tiny noise, and they stopped. They had a look around, looked under the bed, nothing. Then someone opened the cupboard. They didn't see anything, but then they started moving things around from the cupboard. They took all the clothes away. They took all this big pile of clothes that were at the bottom of the cupboard, and they pulled all of that off, and there they found Emma. Emma had been found inside her cupboard, hands tied behind her back, a cloth shoved in her mouth, and another cloth, like a bandana, tied around her head to keep the cloth in her mouth from coming out. So I do just want to point out that Emma lives on the 8th floor of this retirement complex. So it's not like someone climbed through the window where she was on the bottom floor through her garden. She was on the 8th floor. Emma was still alive when they found her, and they immediately rushed her to hospital. But because Emma was 93 years old, She was in a really bad way when they found her, and sadly she did end up passing away a week later. But when police came into the apartment, they asked Emma's family to come into the apartment because obviously they would know how Emma lived on a day-to-day basis. So then the police led them in, and her family immediately said, this is not how Emma lives. She is very neat, she's very tidy, her jewelry's missing, her phone is missing, her purse is missing. And when they calculated everything together, around 50,000 rands worth of valuables were taken from Emma's home that day. This case sadly went cold very quickly. Now, there was quite a timeline gap from the December 2015 murder of Emma to when our next case is. I assume it's not because our perpetrators were remorseful and felt really bad for what they did. I doubt that. I assume maybe they were preoccupied, maybe they got busier in work, maybe they were arrested, we don't know, but there was at least a 3-year gap between the first crime and the next crime. But maybe also from 2015 to 2018, when the next crime was recorded, maybe our criminals got away with a few crimes in between. But then on the 24th of June 2018, 86-year-old Engela van Wyk lived in a retirement village or home in an area called Springs. Engela was known to be happy, jovial, very chatty, very loving, and she was known by a lot of people within this retirement village. She was said to be the mother of the retirement village. She would go and chat to you for hours. Are you all right? Let me make you feel better. And that was Engela. Many of the residents would say that they would often sit down and have a biscuit and some coffee or tea with her. And that is what a day-to-day would look like with Engela, her friends, anyone who wanted to just talk to her, say how they feel, they would go to Engela. She was the go-to person. Engela was also incredibly close to her daughter. Her daughter would visit her every day, and they would often go out and do things. When Engela had some of her downtime, she had 5 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. She would knit all day for them. She loved knitting for her grandchildren. And sadly, Engela was actually working on some beanies for her great-grandchild who was going to be born a couple months after this incident. Sadly, she would never complete the task, but the task would be completed by Engela's loved ones. On the 24th of June, residents started feeling uncomfortable because 2 men were walking around the complex knocking on doors. They were asking for water or to use the toilet, and Engela seemed to be the one to let them into her home when others didn't answer. Engela was found in her room later the same day, bound, gagged, and she had sadly passed away. She was found in the same way with a cloth in her mouth and had another bandana-type cloth over her face to keep the cloth in. She was found on the floor in her bedroom. The cloth that was pushed into her mouth was pushed so far in that it had actually blocked her airways and she suffocated. Her home had been absolutely ransacked. Small, inconspicuous items had been taken. And what's really sad about this, like I mentioned, she was very close to her daughter. She was actually not supposed to be home that day. Her daughter had fallen ill, so she was recovering. She didn't want to make her mom sick. And they were supposed to go out that day for lunch or for supper. But sadly, because her daughter was recovering, they didn't end up doing that. The police had not yet linked Emma and Engela's murders. The MO was very similar, but they were in 2 completely different areas, which didn't require police to communicate quite yet. But the next crime would not take months or years to take place. The next crime took place much quicker. Just 2 weeks after Engela's murder, 2 men and 1 woman arrived at a retirement home in Munsieville in Mpumalanga, and they told the security guard that they were there to collect donations for the area that they stayed in from a lady named Tani Marie. The guard then let them in, and the 3 headed into the complex and went door to door knocking. But for some reason, and thankfully, when they went into the specific retirement home, it was full of people's loved ones. Many of the rooms were busy and buzzing with loved ones walking in and out, bringing gifts, and there were so many people in the complex, and the 3 then decided to just this was not the area that they were going to head into. But as a side note, sometimes when I read these cases or I'm going through the case, I wonder, why is CCTV not used? This is 2015, 2018. It's not that long ago. We had cameras back then. Why was it not used? But I think police might have seen the people on the CCTV. But how do you figure out who they are? If they're using a fake number plate, how do you ever find these people? The 3, after leaving the area in Mbombela, they decided to go 2 kilometers away to an area called Macadamia Center. And speaking of CCTV, this place was inundated with CCTV. When police would later catch the criminals, there was a CCTV of the faces as they entered, but also of the number plate at the same time. When they drove, there was CCTV there, and also down the whole passageway of like all the homes on each floor. Everywhere they went, they were followed by CCTV. So when this vehicle arrived, they arrived at 12:07 in the afternoon. They parked in the visitors' parking bay, and the three of them did their typical run of knocking on doors, asking for the loo, asking for some water. But what residents found strange was the way that they approached people. Now, I do get it. When you have to go, you have to go. Sometimes you're not thinking about being very polite when you're knocking on someone's door asking for the toilet. People would say that the three of them would ask for the toilet, but they would all kind of stand back when the door opened, kind of like looking in and having a look around. And this is what the residents found quite weird. They didn't want to let people in who were having a good look into their home. So they just closed the door and said, no, thank you, you're not welcome to use my toilet. But sadly, 85-year-old Henrietta Potgieter was one to let the three of them in to use the loo. And it was said for this case that a neighbor heard someone saying to Henrietta that they were waiting for their gran and that they needed to use the toilet, which I do find quite weird, because if you're waiting for your gran, why wouldn't you just use her toilet? But anyway, the cameras then placed the three of them leaving 30 minutes later in the same vehicle. The same resident who overheard people saying they're waiting for their gran, can we use the toilet, then started hearing that the TV was very loud in Henrietta's room, and the neighbor was instantly concerned because it was quite late and she knew that Henrietta went to bed very early. So she was worried that maybe Henrietta fell in the bath, maybe she had fallen on the side of the bed and she couldn't get up. So she asked the estate manager to open the door to make sure that she's okay. But sadly, Henrietta was not. Mbombela received a call from the retirement village, and Lieutenant Colonel Earnhard Stroh was called to the retirement village. He had no idea what this call would lead to and how much this call would change his life and perspective on people. When Lieutenant Colonel entered and he heard the TV blaring, he noticed that there was no forced entry, but the room was in a complete state, and it looked like this person really struggled. Henrietta was found in her bathroom with her arms and legs bound, and once again a cloth shoved into her mouth and another cloth around her head to keep the cloth in place. Not only that, but someone had also shoved a pad over Henrietta's nose so that she couldn't breathe, and she had also been beaten badly around her head. Henrietta's nose was broken and there was a lot of blood inside her throat and inside her mouth. Police believe that Henrietta did not want to give the safe combination which was in her room. They did not end up taking the money that was inside the safe because Henrietta would not give it up, and they suffocated her because of that. Lieutenant Colonel was absolutely livid, to say the least. He vowed to make sure that Henrietta's death did not go unpunished. And when he called the loved ones of Henrietta, they arrived at her home and they opened up the safe, and inside the safe was 10,000 Rand cash and a little bit of jewelry. Lieutenant Colonel Stroh was so taken aback by the brutality and the immense force that they had placed on this elderly woman. But while police were having a look around the room, Lieutenant Colonel Stroh was sitting there and he said, no, there's something off about this case, and he knew that the perpetrators had done this before. He said that there were no mistakes in this room. There were no gloves that were left behind. There was no evidence that was left behind. They clearly had worn gloves to protect their fingerprints from touching everything. They came prepared with the cloths. It's not like they had torn it off her jacket or her jersey to place around her mouth in a robbery gone bad. They came prepared, knowing exactly what they were going to do, and Lieutenant Colonel Stroh tried to put these puzzle pieces together. So Lieutenant Colonel Stroh headed straight to the security guard's office and asked for the CCTV. He then saw the vehicle with the three people. He saw them leave 30 minutes after they arrived, and he also noticed that when they walked back to their vehicle, one of the men had a piece of cloth in his hand. The piece of cloth that matched the exact cloth that was on Henrietta's body, and Lieutenant Colonel Stroh immediately ran the number plate, which he figured out pretty quickly was fake. But he thought, let's still run this number plate through the LPR, which is the license plate recognition software. And so they eventually actually got a hit because they thought, let's try and track this vehicle's movements even though the number plate is fake. So what police actually figured out, and while they were tracking this vehicle, the police noticed that the perpetrators actually switched this fake number plate to a GP registered number plate. And if you're not South African, the GP means it's Gauteng province, which is where the number plate originates from. Like if you lived in Cape Town, you would generally have a CA number plate. Cape Town, or a CT number plate, or a WC for the Western Cape. It just depends where you are, and that's the initial on the front is the province, sometimes where you're from, and the little letters just determine which area your number plate is registered from. But when they ran the actual real GP number plate that they switched, the police realized quickly that the number plate did not belong to any three of the people in the vehicle. It had actually been reported stolen a couple days ago, and what was on the police docket said that it was a private mechanic job that had been done by this certain person, and that the vehicle was never returned from this mechanic. Then 1 week after Henrietta was murdered, the vehicle they were tracing with the number plate showed up in a caravan park called Lovers Rock in Magaliesburg, and it was still parked there when police showed up. Police then knocked on the door very impolitely and very loudly and gained entry into the caravan and detained Sean Oosthuizen, Johnny Duploy, and Morena Forster. Initially, when the three were arrested, they had absolutely no idea what the police were talking about. They were like, we've never heard of these people. We don't drive that vehicle. But then police started showing them the actual CCTV footage and the video of the three of them in this vehicle, all lined in a row, entering the premises, and then their tune started to change. And then they decided to say, oh no, we were at Macadamia Center. I totally forgot. We were just collecting donations for the Afrikaners who moved in with their caravan on the border of Munsieville. Remember those who were all in the newspaper? That's what we were doing. And I do just want to remind you that that was years ago when those newspaper articles were written. I think that was 2014, and it was now 2018. But then they changed their tune again. And then they said that Henrietta, the person that was murdered, they said that, oh no, she actually messaged someone that we know on Facebook to say that we can come and collect a few things for donation. So that's why we were there. That's why we went to her specific room. And that's why we were so quick, because we just quickly grabbed what we needed and left. They said that they left Henrietta alive. They never touched her. They never harmed her. And it was not them who murdered her. But Lieutenant Colonel Stroh believed absolutely nothing that was coming out of their mouths. And he did end up arresting Sean and Johnny. The CCTV footage was not clear enough to see her face. They did see the men very clearly, but her face was slightly blurred, and they did not have enough concrete evidence to place her at the scene. During the build-up of this case, Lieutenant Colonel Stroh was contacted by other police because they had heard of the arrest and they wanted to say that there were possible links to other crimes, which included robberies at old age homes and the murder of Emma and Engela. But this is where it is quite sad, because the magistrate who was looking over this case, Lieutenant Colonel Stroh, and the other police officers from these other areas really believed that these cases were linked. But the magistrate said, no, they're definitely not linked. He would completely dismiss Lieutenant Colonel Stroh. He was saying that they did not have enough evidence. It does not make any sense. Why are you bringing these cases to me? They do not even link. And the Lieutenant Colonel said to the magistrate, if you let these men go, they are going to kill again. But the magistrate did not listen, and on the 3rd of August 2018, the men were released for 2,000 Rand each. Then, 77-year-old Lillis Jane Marie was a great-grandmother. She absolutely loved her family to bits. She was so proud of all her children, grandchildren, and even one of her grandchildren were getting married in September, and she was really looking forward to it. Then, on the 20th of August 2018, Lillis, who lived with her son at the time, she was in bed and her son headed out for work as usual. But when he returned, he put his key in the door, he opened the door, called out for his mom, and he heard nothing. The home was very quiet. He then quietly walked to his mom's room to see if maybe she had fallen asleep. She wasn't there. He then walked to the particular chair that she liked to sit in. She wasn't there. Then he thought, let me just go back to her bedroom. Maybe she's under the covers weirdly and I just didn't look properly. So he then walked back into her bedroom, and on the other side of the bed, which he never looked, he found his mom, sadly, who had passed away. She had been bound, gagged. She had a cloth inside her mouth with like a bandana thing around her head to keep the cloth inside. And when her son had a really good look after finding his mother, he noticed that her drawers were slightly open. Her little bits of clothing were kind of tucked outside of the drawers, and clearly something had gone on in here, and he had been robbed and his mom had been murdered. All the criminals took from Lillis was 500 Rand and her cell phone and a tiny bit of jewelry. Then, 2 weeks after Lillis's murder, on the 1st of September 2018, 77-year-old Barbara Fenton lived in a retirement village in Alberton. Barbara went out that day with her daughter and they went out for lunch, had a really nice day. And when I think about this case, it really honestly just breaks my heart. Imagine you take your mom or your grandmother out for lunch, you're having the best day, you take her home, you wave goodbye, you give her a kiss, and that's the last time you see her. Barbara was then dropped off back at the retirement village around 4:30 in the afternoon. Then around the same time, a man rang Barbara's neighbor from the gate, and this man said he is looking for Tannie Marie. And in English, I'm not sure if I've said this earlier when he said Tannie Marie earlier, but Tannie just means auntie, so he was looking for Auntie Marie. And the lady actually buzzed in because she couldn't quite hear what the man was saying. She didn't hear the name. She thought that it was for her. So she buzzed the guy in and she's busy buzzing, and she let him in and she waits a couple minutes. She goes back, gets something out the fridge. She comes back to her front door and she kind of looks out because no one has come. So she then closes the door and goes back to what she was doing and thought, oh, well, maybe he found what he was looking for and he left. But something was eating away at this lady who buzzed the person in, because she said when she opened the door, she did notice a vehicle was parked outside Barbara's flat, but she didn't think anything of it because she didn't hear the vehicle approach when she was waiting for the person. But she did notice this vehicle, but she's never seen it before out of Barbara's loved ones. So when she closed the door the first time and she went on with the other things she was doing in her home, she then had that nagging feeling that something's not right. So she then went back out and she took a photo of the vehicle because she said something about this vehicle is off. And then she went back into her flat and she kind of potted around with this nagging feeling in the back of her head. Then, a couple hours later, after she buzzed the person in, she had a knock at her door. When she went and opened the door, she saw that it was Barbara's son-in-law. And she thought that this was incredibly strange, but her son-in-law looked really stressed because he said that he was knocking on Barbara's door and he was here to deliver groceries that Barbara had asked for, but she's not answering the door. And Barbara's son-in-law knew that this lady had a spare key to Barbara's flat because they were neighbors, they were very close. So she said, oh, don't worry, I will grab the key and I'll open the door for you. The neighbor then said she'll gladly just take the groceries, pop them on Barbara's desk, maybe she's sleeping, and she'll head back out. She then takes the groceries from Barbara's son-in-law, she then opens the door, enters the room, and then kind of turns to the side, and as soon as she turns, she puts the groceries down and she runs out crying. Barbara's son-in-law then enters the flat and sees exactly why she was crying. Barbara was on the floor and sadly she had been murdered. She was bound, gagged, and another piece of material wrapped around her head with a cloth that had suffocated her in her mouth. She was also strangled and beaten incredibly badly. Her cell phone and jewelry were stolen. But these criminals are clearly not very bright, because first they were caught on CCTV at the Macadamia Center. They were taken into custody because of the CCTV footage using that vehicle, and then a photo gets handed to police with the same vehicle and the same number plate. They hadn't changed anything. They literally got out of prison and used the exact same vehicle. Like, guys, come on. I mean, at least change the vehicle. But Sean and Johnny were quickly arrested and taken back into custody. And they were arrested and charged for the murders of Lillis and Barbara. But this time, remember Lieutenant Colonel Stroh said that these criminals had done this before. There was no DNA, there were no cigarette butts or anything lying about. But clearly, Sean and Johnny had got incredibly cocky, because at Lillis's murder and at Barbara's murder, DNA was collected from the scene. There was DNA on the gags that had been used around the mouth, and especially the cloth that was shoved into the mouth. There was quite a lot of DNA in there because it was quite forcefully pushed in, and especially the cloth around the mouth as well to keep everything in place, because someone's fingers had been obviously used to tie this knot, and a lot of skin and DNA was found on this knot, and there was no longer gloves that were being used. And also they had left a lot of cigarette butts at the crime scene, not only inside the flat but also outside of where the vehicle had been presumably parked. And then on the 5th of November 2019, the trial for the murder of Barbara Fenton began. And the reason that they started with Barbara Fenton's murder first was because there was so much DNA and so much evidence for this case. And what they wanted to do was Lieutenant Colonel Stroh really wanted to make sure that they try the strongest case first to make sure that these guys are in prison and arrested so that they can at least gather more evidence for the other crimes. So initially, the guys pleaded not guilty. They said that they were only there because they were asking for donations at Barbara's house. But when they got into her flat, when she let them in, they asked if they could charge their phones. They were really down on battery on their phones. Could they have some water, please? Could they also use the loo? And Barbara was like, sure, no problem. Charge your phone. Here's some water. There's the toilet. And they also noticed that when they were walking around Barbara's flat, they noticed all this jewelry. And they said they just couldn't help themselves. They really wanted the jewelry. And these guys were adamant that they were so nice to Barbara. They just did this so that they could just take the jewelry. They just wanted to do that and then they wanted to go. They said that it wasn't them who killed her. They just bound and gagged her and someone else came into the flat and murdered her after they left. They had nothing to do with beating her and murdering her. But then as they both started to talk in this trial, they clearly saw that things were not aligning properly and they then started to turn on each other. Sean then said, oh, it wasn't me. Yes, we bound and gagged her, but it wasn't me. Johnny was left alone with Barbara in the flat. It was him who murdered her. He was the one who beat her and murdered her. And the judge was just like, enough. We're not having any more of this discussion. And they were found guilty of murder of Barbara Fenton. Sean had been given a life sentence plus 25 years, and Johnny had been given a life sentence plus 20 years. The other trials would follow, and the next would be the trial of Engela van Wyk in 2020, and Sean and Johnny were handed down life sentences once again. But while Sean was in prison, it was said that he found the light. He decided to confess to the murder of Lillis and Emma, and he said that Johnny had nothing to do with it. So Emma and Lillis's murders did not end up in a trial, but Sean was handed down an extra 2 life sentences for their murders. Sean and Johnny were brought to trial for Henrietta's murders, and they were both found guilty as well and sentenced to life. So in total, Sean had 5 life sentences and Johnny had 3. But Lieutenant Colonel Stroh really had a bone to pick with Morena Forster. He really felt deep down inside that she was guilty and he wanted her to serve for the crimes that she had committed. And when he looked really hard into this case, he noticed that yes, there was no DNA or cigarette butts inside the flats of the earlier murders, but he did notice that there were cigarette butts in the gutters of these earlier murders that had been picked up, but not necessarily linked to the case because they didn't believe that people who wore gloves inside the flat would leave DNA evidence outside the flat. So the DNA was never tested on these cigarette butts outside the flat of the earlier murders. And he remembered he noticed a packet of cigarettes in her pocket when she had to hand everything to the police when she was first being arrested. So after a couple of months after he decided to test the DNA on these cigarettes, it came back and it perfectly matched. So she was charged with the murder of Engela van Wyk, but there is no outcome to this, so I think that she's still in trial for this murder. And even though this trial is still ongoing, I think that she was much more of a key player than we think that she was. If you think about it, if you're an elderly woman, I'm not sure that you would open the door to 2 men standing there if you were living on your own. She could have been used to get the elderly woman to open their doors because maybe she looked more trustworthy and the guys were maybe on the wing and came into the flat after the door was open. It's just a speculation. It might not be true. But I think what is really sad about this case is the lives that these monsters destroyed. And I think it is an incredibly cowardly thing to murder and brutally beat elderly women who have absolutely no way of defending themselves. There were at least a minimum of 2 people each time they entered the flat, and these women had no way of pushing these perpetrators off or defending themselves. They didn't even care. After they were released, they continued to offend, and they continued to offend in the exact same way and continued to murder. They didn't even change their vehicle. They didn't even change the number plate, and they didn't even use gloves, or they left all of their DNA in the later 2 murders. They felt nothing for their victims and they didn't care about the lives that they were ruining. But let me know what you think of this case down below. I hope you're all doing well, and I also hope that you and your families have a wonderful Easter break. Please stay safe out there on the roads, and I will see you again next time. Bye.